Well, we've got new information about Capitano possibly being playable in version 6.x, and it's definitely worth discussing. In this video, I'll go over everything we currently know, including past and present leaks, Hoyoverse's marketing choices, and what this could mean for Capitano's future in Genshin Impact. And here's something interesting. So far, no insider has outright said that Capitano is unplayable. Sure, some leaks have mentioned that he isn't coming in Natlan, but there's no solid confirmation that he's completely off the table. That alone makes this topic worth exploring until the very end, so let's break it all down. One of the biggest signs pointing towards Capitano's importance is the fact that Hoyoverse released not one, but two fully animated trailers dedicated to him. Now, think about this. When was the last time they did something like this for a character who wasn't playable? Signora, for example, never got a proper animated trailer after she was ashed in Inazuma. So, what's the takeaway? If Hoyoverse wanted to pay respects to Capitano, they could have done it in a much simpler way. Instead, they went all in, giving us cinematic storytelling, a strong character presence, and a setup that feels like it's leading to something bigger. And with what we know now, that something bigger might just be his eventual release in version 6X. On top of that, it looks like we'll be getting Winter Lazo 2.0 on January 15th. And guess what? It's very likely connected to Capitano. The first Winter Lazo trailer gave us a deep dive into the Fatui Harbingers. Now that we're getting a second part, it makes sense that it would continue that story, especially with Snezhnaya getting closer in version 6.0. If Hoyoverse follows the same pattern as before, this Winter Lazo sequel could give us even more details about Capitano's role, possibly even teasing his return in some way. If they're building him up this much right before we enter Snezhnaya, that alone makes it even harder to believe he's permanently gone. Now, let's talk about the latest leak, Capitano being playable in version 6.x. This info comes from Flying Flame, a well-known leaker, and while many sources have reposted it as questionable, it hasn't been completely denied. Considering how much Hoyoverse is hyping up Capitano, it's not that far-fetched to think that they're setting up for his eventual playable release. Think about it. Why would Hoyoverse spend this much time building his character, giving him a major cinematic presence and potentially setting up an entire Winter Lazo event around him if he was just meant to be an off-screen casualty? It doesn't add up. Even if this particular leak is unconfirmed, the overall trend suggests that Capitano's story isn't over yet. But what were leakers saying about Capitano before all of this? Let's go back to 2024. The first real leak about Capitano came from Uncle 404 in July 2024, stating that Capitano presently didn't have a playable plan. The key word here is presently. This wording is important because it doesn't rule out future playability. It just means that at that time there were no active plans, which makes sense because, well, at the moment, he's dead. Yes, I put dead in quotes marks, and I'll explain why in a bit. Then we got more updates. Genshin Intel mentioned Capitano to be playable, which directly contradicts earlier concerns. Miruko later clarified that Capitano will not be playable in version 5.x, which again doesn't deny his playability in 6.x or beyond. Iris also confirmed that Capitano would not be released as a playable character during Natlan's updates, but this was never a full statement against his future playability. Finally, when character IDs were leaked, Capitano was found to have only an NPC ID at the time, which led many to believe he wouldn't be playable. So what does this tell us? Most leaks didn't say Capitano was permanently unplayable. They just emphasized that he wasn't coming in Natlan, which aligns with what we're hearing now about his possible release in 6X. Now, let's talk about the big question. Is Capitano actually dead? From what we've seen in the recent Archon quest, it seems like Capitano sacrificed himself, taking on the death penalty meant for Mavuika in order to fulfill a deal involving Renova's power. But if we take a closer look at how this situation unfolded, it becomes clear that he may not actually be dead, and there's a strong case for his return as a playable character in version 6X. The reason Capitano had to die was tied to Renova's power, which required a life sacrifice as payment. Originally, this cost was supposed to fall on Mavuika, but Capitano stepped in and volunteered to take her place. Now, the key issue here is that Renova's contract specifies that the one who uses the power must be the one to pay the price, which means, by all logic, Mavuika should have been the one affected. However, Renova's contract also states that a substitute can take the sacrifice, as long as their value is considered equivalent to the original person. That's how Capitano was able to offer himself in place of Mavuika. But this is where things get interesting. Capitano isn't just any normal person. Since Capitano couldn't physically die, something else happened. His soul and body were separated. According to the records, his body still exists, but remains in a dormant state, while his soul fused with God of Death. This is important because it shows that Capitano still technically exists, just in a different form. Unlike Signora, who was burned to ashes and left no trace, Capitano's physical form is still intact, and his soul is bound to another entity. And here's a crucial detail. He is actually still breathing while sitting, meaning his body is still alive, just inactive. There's also symbolism at play in his story. Capitano's emblem resembles the 3 nails of the crucifixion, a reference to the death and resurrection of Christ. In Christian lore, Christ was executed, but rose again on the 3rd day. And if we apply this parallel to Capitano, it hints at the idea that his death is only temporary, and his return is inevitable. Even in his final scene, we see butterflies, which in many cultures symbolize rebirth and transformation. One of the biggest clues that Capitano is next in line as a playable character comes from the Harbinger wheel pattern, which has been surprisingly accurate so far. This emblem depicts all 11 Fatui Harbingers, each represented by a distinct symbol. Now, here's where things get interesting. If we look at the pattern of which Harbingers have become playable, they have followed a counterclockwise order on this wheel. Columbina is next, and leaks have already confirmed her upcoming release. And right after Columbina on the wheel, Capitano. This pattern suggests that Hoyoverse is systematically going down the wheel counterclockwise, making Capitano the next logical choice after Columbina. If this holds true, he would be released in Snezhnaya, aligning perfectly with the version 6.x rumors. The Harbinger wheel theory has accurately predicted the release order so far, and if it continues to be correct, Capitano's playability is practically inevitable. So what do we know so far? Hoyoverse has heavily promoted Capitano, giving him 2 fully animated trailers and a major presence in the game's storyline, something they've never done for a permanently dead character. Winter Lazo 2.0 is set to release on January 15th, and all signs point to it being connected to Capitano, possibly shedding more light on his fate. A recent leak from Flying Flame suggests he will be playable in version 6.x, and while some sources have marked it as questionable, no one has outright denied it. Older leaks never said Capitano was permanently unplayable, just that he wouldn't be released in Atlan, leaving the door open for his return. His body is still intact, he is still breathing, and his soul exists separately, meaning his death is far from absolute. With all of this in mind, Capitano's return seems more likely than ever. Whether he comes back in Snezhnaya's main story, through a revival mechanic, or some other twist, one thing is certain: his story isn't over yet. So, what do you think? Do you believe Capitano will be playable in version 6.x, or do you think Hoyoverse is just building hype with no payoff? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay updated on Genshin Impact news and speculation, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Save up to 23% on Mavuika banner at lootbar.gg. All you need is your UID and server. The link is in the description.